Professor Yao, thank you very much for inviting me here today. The title of my talk is What Are My Odds? And I think that's appropriate. I think my luck is actually running rather bad today because I've been chosen to follow such an erudite and entertaining lecture by the previous speaker. But hopefully I'll be able to impart a little bit of interesting information to you if I can. The subject is going to be historical and modern efforts to win at games of chance. And the things that are going to be discussed are how gambling and a desire to win at gambling inspired the scientific study of probability. I'm going to talk about three key mathematical concepts that emerged during that early study which describe the majority of gambling phenomenon. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some modern contributions of mathematicians to solving present-day gambling problems. Everything begins with gambling, or at least the important modern history begins in 1654. And there was a well-known gambler in Paris named Chevalier de Marais, and he was perplexed by a seemingly inconsistent result in some of the popular games of chance that were played at the time. The illustration on the left is not really the Chevalier, but it's a person in the costume of the time, so that may be what he looked like. His particular question that he was dealing with was a game of betting on rolls of dice, and his question was, why, if it is profitable to wager that a 6 will appear within 4 rolls of 1 die, then why is it not profitable to wager that double 6s will appear within 24 rolls of 2 dice? And the reason is because both of those represent 4 rolls of a dice represent 2/3 of the possible combinations on a 6-sided dice, and 24 rolls represents also 2/3 of the total ways that 2 dice could come out, which is a total of 36 combinations. Now, he thought those should be the same. Now, de Marais took his question to his friend Blaise Pascal. As we all know, Mr. Pascal was one of the greats of mathematics, so de Marais was very lucky to have him as a friend. Stimulated by de Marais' question, Pascal began a very now famous chain of correspondence with another mathematician of the time, which is Pierre de Fermat, of Fermat's last theorem, who was living at that time, and the two of those were friends. Now, in their discussions, and the letters have been examined by historians of mathematics for many years, but it was evident that to those two that no existing theory existed that adequately described a solution to de Marais' problem. What resulted was a chain of correspondence extending for some years, but all of the important ideas, or I should say the important ideas for a foundation of the theory of probability, resulted from that correspondence. The three key concepts I'm going to talk about that relate to practical problems in gambling are 1, probability, 2, the concept of mathematical expectation, and 3, what's known as the law of large numbers. Firstly, probability. The early work on probability dealt with games such as dice tossing games or dice rolling games or coin tossing games, where the game could be broken down into a certain number of equally likely possible outcomes. For instance, a die has 6 sides, and if you roll 1 die, then there are 6 possible outcomes. Any one of the 6 numbers could come up, and the probability of a particular side coming up is given by the number of sides or the number of events that cause that to be true. So on rolling a dice, the chance of a 5 coming up, for instance, is 1 out of 6, because there's 6 possible outcomes, all equally likely, and one of those corresponds to winning. So the probability in that case would be 1/6. A further refinement to the definition of probability, I should not say a refinement, but an extension, is to say that the probability of any event can be limited to or can be expressed as the limit of the number of successes or successful outcomes over the number of trials. And if you see, looking back at this, the form of that equation is very similar. This is more of a generalization of the theory to say that it's the limit of an observed frequency can be also thought of as the probability. The second very big idea that's very relevant to gambling problems is the idea of mathematical expectation. Now, this idea was first attributed to the Dutch mathematician Christian Huygens, who is pictured there on the right. And now the definition of mathematical expectation, which I'm sure you're all familiar with this concept, being mathematicians, is it's a weighted average of a random variable. And that equation at the bottom expresses the expectation of a random variable x is simply the various values that x can assume each times its probability of occurring. So p sub 1 times x sub 1, p sub 2 times x sub 2, etc., summed together, and that would be a kind of weighted average outcome. And the reason that is so important for gambling is because the result of a gamble can be thought of as a random variable that can assume various values. In this case, usually winning or losing, for instance. So if we look at the probability for, let's say, the return on a particular bet, there's a certain probability of a profit, so p times the profit, plus 1 minus p, which would be the opposite probability, or the complementary probability of a loss, and that would equal your expectation. And to make that a little bit more clear, I've worked it out there in numbers at the bottom of the screen for the case of a bet on roulette. Now, on a roulette wheel, as I'm sure you're all familiar, or you know what one looks like, there's 38 possible numbers, and if you win, you get back a net win of 35, and if you lose, you lose the unit that you bet. So a particular bet at roulette, you have a 1 in 38 chance of winning a 35 profit and a 37 in 38 chance of losing your $1, and that all averages out to a net return of minus 0.0526. So your expectation for placing a bet on a roulette layout would be to lose 0.0526, that fraction of your money, basically. So it's a negative expectation. Another property of expectation, which is very, very important for the gambler, is that expectation is additive. When you make a series of bets, each one of those will have a specific expectation. Your overall expectation, that is your overall average or mean result for a series of gambles or a series of plays at a particular game, is going to be simply the sum of the individual expectations of the bets you made. And so that leads to a rule number 1, as I'll call it, which is that the only way to achieve a long-term expected profit in gambling is to make a series of bets that have a net positive expectation. Now, the last of the 3 big concepts I wanted to talk about is the law of large numbers. And this is one way of naming this particular phenomenon. But now, gambling typically involves playing a series of repeated trials of a particular game. That could be bets at the horse races, or plays at the blackjack table in the casino, or plays at the roulette wheel. And that had been, independent trials or repeated repetitions of an experiment had been studied quite carefully by Bernoulli, Jacob Bernoulli, that is, of one of the Bernoulli brothers. And in fact, the outcomes of repeated trials are often called Bernoulli trials in honor of Jacob Bernoulli. And down below we see the famous formula, which is the binomial distribution, and that is a formula which tells us the probability of particular numbers of successes in a given string of trials. Now, again, I think as a group of mathematicians, you know much of this, but as the number of trials increases, the expected ratio of successes to trials converges stochastically to the expected result. So in this case, I'm showing a series of results, and what's graphed there is the proportion of successes, and they're clustering there around the 50-50 or the 0.5 point. Excuse me. So tying these 3 concepts together, being able to express the chance of an event as a probability allowed the mathematical analysis of any wager. And the additive property of mathematical expectation enabled the calculation of the overall expected result of a series of wagers. And the law of large numbers guarantees that the actual result of a series of wagers is going to converge stochastically towards the expected result. Now, let's get down to some practical things now. Here's a graph or a chart showing how one might fare at a particular game of chance. Now, what I've shown here is the solid dark line running just above the x-axis in this graph is the graph of the expectation at a particular game. Now, this would be typical if you were playing a biased coin flipping game. So let's say you're flipping a coin, but instead of the coin being perfectly 50-50, it's slightly positive so that it maybe comes up heads 51% of the time and tails 49% of the time. Let's say you win $1 when it comes up heads, and you lose $1 when it comes up tails. So as you're playing along, the number of trials goes along the x-axis here, and your result is on the y-axis. So the expected result, that is the average or mean result of the series of trials, you can see is creeping upwards as you move along slightly. So by the end of 100 trials, you'd expect to be a couple of units ahead. But what's more important here, and what's kind of more interesting as a phenomenon, is that the spread or the possible variation in your result is given by the blue lines first, is the 1 standard deviation spread, and the pink dotted line on the outside is the 2 standard deviation result. So basically this chart describes what could happen to you in 100 trials of a very even coin flipping game with a narrow advantage towards the player. Your mean result is to be slightly ahead of even, so you would have made a little bit of money. But your actual result could very easily be anywhere within those different ranges. So you could be up or down. We're seeing 10 or 20 units plus or minus are quite realistic possibilities for where you could be after that period of time. This is what people typically face. Now, if you're in a casino, it would be very much like this, except that your expectation would be a little bit negative. Instead of having an expected positive result after an hour's play or after 100 trials, you'd actually have a negative expected result. So this would be sort of a rotation of this graph around the x-axis with your probability of losing. But it would basically say that you could walk into a casino, and even if you had a negative expected result, in 1 hour's play or 100 trials, you could be anywhere. You could be winning a lot, you could be losing a lot, and that's what people typically go to a casino for. Now, what I've shown here is now the medium run. That was the short run, 100 trials. Now I've showing the medium run of the same game. So this is basically the same probabilities operating, except that this time I've run it out to 10,000 trials. So now what you see has happened here is that the expectation has grown much larger. We now see that we're have an expected positive return of about 100 units. And this has shifted where the standard deviation lines fall as well. Now we see that most of your probable return is very much above the x-axis. So you're heading to where you'd have to be at least 1 standard deviation below expectation. That is where the blue dashed line crosses the x-axis over around the 10,000 mark. So 2/3 or most of the time you'd be winning in this particular game, or I should say more like 5/6 of the time. So there'd only be results more than 1 standard deviation below chance would result in you being a net loser. So you're doing pretty good at this point. And let's go to an even longer run. This is the sort of the long run. Now this is maybe 100,000 plays at a particular game. And what you're seeing is that your expectation, the thick black line, has gone up considerably. You're now expected to be 1,000 units ahead. And the 2 standard deviation line shows that even if you've had an extremely bad run of luck, that is, you're doing much worse than expectation, you're still bound to be ahead, basically. So you're more or less guaranteed to be winning at this point. So this is the law of large numbers sort of applied to gambling in action. And basically what it's saying here is a sort of a corollary to the law of large numbers, that in a gambling game, your real result will eventually come very close to your expected result, or it'll become, the percentage-wise will become expected. So if you're playing an advantageous game with a positive edge for the player, you're definitely going to win eventually. But I had actually done these particular charts up for a talk about a winning gambling system. The truth of the matter is that for a typical gambler in a casino, it's just the opposite. All of these charts would be just the reverse. If you went in and played for an hour, you could be winning or could be losing. You'd have a small negative expected result. If you played for 100 hours, which would be roughly 10,000 trials of, say, blackjack over in Macau or something like this, you'd be almost certainly losing, but there'd be some chance, again, this graph would be reversed, there'd be about a 1 in 6 chance, that is greater than 1 standard deviation chance, that you might be ahead. But if you went to Macau and you played for 100,000 trials, which might be something like 1,000 hours of play, which a heavy gambler could do in a year, you'll certainly be behind, basically. There's almost no chance that you'll be ahead. So that's a warning to people who play games with negative expectations. Now I'd like to go on to something a little bit more interesting after those theoretical preliminaries, and that's the modern contributions of mathematicians to some unsolved gambling problems. Firstly, it's true that the basic problems, the important problems, were all solved in the 17th century. There was a particular period dating from 1654 when Pascal and Fermat first started working on the problem. Within about 50 years, most of the major ideas had been developed, and the machinery was in place to solve most gambling problems. However, there are occasional new theoretical developments, some of which have occurred just in the last 50 years or so. But increasingly also the computer-based mathematical techniques have now been used by gamblers and researchers to try to find winning systems at games that had previously seemed immune to such assaults. Basically games that couldn't be beaten before, people have now found ways to do it. The first one I'll talk about is an analytic result that was made by a gentleman named J.L. Kelly. Kelly was a researcher working at the Bell Laboratories, of the Bell Telephone Company fame in the 1950s. And he was working on the theory of information transmission, but realized that one of his findings could actually be applied to gambling. And what he solved was the problem was, what fraction of his capital should a gambler risk on each play? And this is a very practical problem. Usually if you have a system and you're a gambler, you also have a finite amount of capital, and that's something that is not necessarily told to you by any of the other theorems that I talked about before, the expectation or the law of large numbers. It doesn't tell you precisely how much money you should risk on each play of the game, and that's what his result told us. His result has proven to be very generally applicable to different gambling situations, and it's used very widely by professional gamblers today. What Kelly did was to define something called it's called the Kelly criterion sometimes, is he defined the exponential rate of growth of a gambler's capital, G, as being the limit of this X of n, which is final capital versus his starting capital, as a game is played on, and n being the number of trials. The derivation and the solution to this is a little bit involved and beyond the scope of this lecture, but it gives some very simple results. So for instance, in a coin flipping game where the coin was slightly biased, for instance, let's say you had a coin where or a game where you win $1 if the coin comes up heads, and you lose $1 if it comes up tails, but instead of the coin being 50-50, it's actually has a 0.51 probability of heads and a 0.49 probability of tails. So that'd be a slightly advantageous game. And let's say you have $1,000 as your total capital. Well, the Kelly formula, maximizing that function G as above as according to the fraction of your capital that you wager on each play, it comes to a very simple formula, which is you should wager 2 times P, and P being the probability of winning, 2 times P minus 1. So if P is 0.51, you would want to wager 0.02 of your capital. So if you had $10,000, you'd want to risk $20 on each play, or $20 on the first play, I should say, but then always recalculating as your capital grew or shrank, depending on whether you're winning or losing. You would always outlay exactly 0.02 or 2% of your capital. It's a very important result, and it's used very widely. The second big area is not a theoretical advance, but rather it's a practical advance in gambling. I think many of you will know the game of blackjack. To those who don't, I'm really not going to be able to describe it here adequately, but I'll assume that most of you do. That's a game where the player receives 2 cards and the dealer receives 1 card which is visible to the player, and another card which is hidden. Now the object of the game is to achieve a point total of your cards in your hand as being close to 21 as possible without exceeding that number. It's a game that has both skill and chance elements because you have a choice of whether you take additional cards or you don't take cards. Now, this has been a popular game in casinos since the late 1800s, and it was solved in 1960s. So it had been around for about 70 years and was quite popular, but it had so far eluded solution because while the rules of the game were very well defined and there was no theoretical challenge, the fact that it was dealt from a deck of cards and that there were a large number of discrete, I call them card order dependencies, it made it very difficult to enumerate all the possibilities. And even though it would be not theoretically complicated to simply write out on paper all of the probabilities, it would be millions of different combinations that you would have to write out and test, and so it wasn't able to be done manually. Now, around 1960s, the early 1960s, when digital computers first became available for use in frivolous pursuits like figuring out card games, a gentleman named Edward Thorpe decided he was going to use a computer to determine the optimal strategy for blackjack. And he did that work in conjunction with some people at IBM. And in 1962, he published a book called Beat the Dealer. And this book was a watershed event in professional gambling, or in I'd say, the modern interest of mathematicians in gambling, because for the first time it was now possible to use a mathematical strategy to achieve a positive expected return at a popular casino game. So basically, anyone who read this book and learned the strategy could walk into any casino and be playing with a positive edge against the casino. And this started something of a revolution. In fact, that's how I got into the game. I was caught up in this. I read the book and quit what I was doing, which was attending university, and moved to Las Vegas and became a professional gambler. So, you know, it worked, and it still does, and it really generated a lot of interest. What was interesting about this, though, is as a as a technique, was that it wasn't. It was the use of technology to enumerate possibilities. So it was the use of a computer to assist in an arduous manual calculation task, and it wasn't really a theoretical breakthrough, but it was still an interesting use. And in fact, the way that it's done now in blackjack, because computers have gotten so fast, people don't even bother to make calculations. They simply write simulators. So if, for instance, the rules of the game of blackjack are very easy to encode into a computer, and when you want to answer, well, what is the advantage for the player or the house, or what particular strategy is best, it's easiest, rather than writing out a detailed sort of calculation by computer, is to just make a simulator, let it run millions and millions of times or billions of times, and then tabulate the results. And this will answer any question. It's sort of the brute force method of calculation. Now, the last one I wanted to talk about, though, and this is the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, is horse racing. I would say that this particular form of gambling has inspired the most serious and sophisticated efforts in terms of applying modern mathematical techniques to a game of chance. Partly the reason is because there's so much money in horse racing. It's played for very high stakes around the world, especially here in Hong Kong, and therefore it attracts a lot of people who are trying to win at the game. Now, in racing, the challenge that you're faced with is trying to estimate each horse's probability of winning. Now, unlike a well-defined or idealized game like blackjack, which is really just a set of rules, basically, or a game with dice or cards, which again is something that is not, it can be set down as rules. Let there be a dice, let it have 6 sides, let each side have an equal probability of coming up. These are sort of analytical games which don't require any investigation of the real world to solve them. Horse racing, however, involves dealing with real individual horses and modeling real-world phenomena. So it's a departure from pure mathematics. Now, if you wanted to win at horse racing, you have to construct a model, as we said, to estimate the horse's probabilities of winning. Now, the model you want has certain desired characteristics of such a model. One would be that it could combine heterogeneous variables into an overall predictor of horse performance. A second is that an estimate of the horse's win probability as the desired output of that model. Third, the probability estimate should sum to 1 within each race. That's kind of a common sense constraint, because we know there's going to be one winning horse out of each horse race. And a way must exist to practically estimate the parameters of the model with real data. Now, we could view the expected performance of a horse as being the result of a number of different variables or factors related to the horse's past performance or the condition of the race. I've written out one such specification here as an example, and we could say that the horse's expected performance equals some coefficient theta times the average finishing position. I call that AV fin. That's a variable which would be the average past finishing position. Plus another coefficient times the number of days since its last race. A third coefficient times the weight carried by the horse. A fourth coefficient times the win percentage of the jockey, etc. You could imagine those going out to, maybe 100 different characteristics of a horse. That all can be expressed by the equation at the bottom, which is that the expected performance V of a horse is equal to a weighted sum of different variables describing the horse's past performance. Now, an actual horse performance in a race, even though its expected performance might be a deterministic thing, the sum of a number of different predictor variables, we all know from common sense that random things can happen in a horse race, or there might be unknown variables that are affecting the horse's performance. So we could say that an actual performance in an individual given race for a horse might be this deterministic component V plus some random error epsilon. This is a common formulation in statistical modeling of all sorts, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it. But if we make the assumption that this epsilon is a normally distributed quantity, then that's going to result in a performance distribution which is normally distributed around a certain mean. And there would be a graph of that. Now, this is, for instance, a graph of the expected running time of a particular horse. So we think that a particular horse is going to run a race in an elapsed time of just under 90 seconds, elapsed time being on the x-axis there, but that his actual performance is going to be somewhere around that due to unknown factors that we can't control for or can't predict. So that's the expected performance of one horse. This would be a look at what an entire race of horses might look like. We might have, let's say, 10 horses in a race, or I think we've got 8 in this particular example. And what we see are a number of different overlapping normal distributions showing, different potential running times for different horses. Now, I've intentionally made these so that each horse doesn't have an equally wide distribution. Some horses might be more consistent and have a sort of a narrower distribution of possible running times. Others might be more uncertain in their performance and have a wider standard deviation. But this sort of mess right here is a number of overlapping predicted running times is what you really have in horse racing. And this leads to something called the probit model of horse racing. And the chance of a particular one of these 8 horses winning is sort of the chance that his performance will be the leftmost of all of these overlapping distributions. And that's expressed by the equation on the bottom, which is a rather complicated equation. If we assume that that is the model of a particular race, then you can create a likelihood function which you can associate with a past series of race. And this was basically the likelihood of the observed winners in a series of, let's say, a past 10,000 races is going to be this product of the winning probabilities assigned to the horse that actually won in each of those particular races. And this results in a very difficult to solve problem. It has to be solved by a very complex iterative method. There's a gentleman actually here in Hong Kong who's pioneered one of the ways to do that, a Professor Gu-Ming Gao at Chinese University. And we've personally have been using his methodology for solving this particular problem in practice. Well, that's I showed you that to give you really a flavor of what kind of work is going on. I've included this graph just because I'm proud of it. This is the actual record of betting using the aforementioned horse racing system, or a methodology very similar to that. And this is a consecutive series of about 6,000 races, which was about 11 years of Hong Kong racing. And the graph is of a sort of an accumulated net profit that we experienced betting on this particular system. And in fact, to those of you who are mathematicians, which I assume is most everyone, the y-axis on this graph is actually a logarithmic scale, because the actual profit chart from using this system was, very much a very, very steep. So to make it fit on a particular page, we had to use a logarithmic graph. So it was, something I'm proud of. Here's a quote from a gentleman who wrote probably one of the best books on the study of mathematics and gambling. And his conclusion was that gamblers can rightfully claim to be the godfathers of probability theory, since they are responsible for provoking the stimulating interplay of gambling and mathematics that provided the impetus to the study of probability. Now, I think that's a true statement, and I think that in the past, certainly it was true in the 1700s or the 1600s when all of this started. These days, it seems that rather than being the inspiration for innovations in mathematics, gamblers these days are more or less the beneficiaries. It's other factors that are driving the development of mathematics now, but keen gamblers are making use of the fruits of mathematics that was oftentimes developed for other areas of endeavor, and applying these same mathematical techniques back to gambling, and oftentimes to great profit. And there's a few references. Thank you.
Great. We will entertain one or two questions. Is there any questions?
Sorry, could you say that again?
To stock markets, for example?
Oh, yeah. The question was, can these strategies be applied to the stock market? Yes, in a matter of fact. I think horse racing is probably the closest analogy, because in the stock market, you're oftentimes, one way of profiting is to be able to predict how a certain company's shares are going to fare, or a particular currency. And oftentimes this involves real-world modeling of the particular underlying instrument. So you would have some model that would predict the future share price based on some past data, in the same way that you would predict a racehorse's performance. So yes, these things can be done, but horse racing is a particularly good field for applying this type of modeling, because the stock market, oftentimes you have unique situations occurring, whereas horse racing is very stable, and you've got the same sort of event occurring thousands of times, which makes it very much amenable to modeling and statistical analysis.
Are the bookies using the same sort of models to set?
Yeah. The question was, are the bookies, that is, are the bookmakers or the people who accept bets on horse racing using the same type of models? And the answer is no, basically. Usually, bookmakers or people like this act as kind of intermediaries for taking bets, and they usually act in a responsive manner, whereby they try to set the odds based on how the people are betting, such that they always keep a certain edge or advantage over the... they act as kind of a toll taker, really. They oftentimes try to limit their risk. And specifically in Hong Kong, I think people may be unclear what you mean by bookmakers, because here we don't have bookmakers, that is, individuals who accept bets on racing. It's all done at the racetrack. And the racetrack operates on the pari-mutuel system, where it withdraws a fixed percentage from the betting pools, and therefore is taking no risk, basically. So no, but it's the gamblers using the models, and not the casinos or the racetracks or the bookmakers.
Hello. Hello, I want to ask in Hong Kong horse racing. Hong Kong horse racing, the odds is a little bit changed before the race, and after you get the probability, what's the? However, the odds is changed. Then how to get the expectation value, and before the race and before the betting, and what is the optimal time to make a bid?
Okay, yes, I understand. That's a very good question, a very astute question, I should say, that calculating the overall expectation for horse racing, once you know the probability of a horse winning, the other thing you have to know is what the payoff is going to be, because it's, the probability of winning times the amount you get if you win, plus the probability of losing times the amount you lose if you lose. That's what adds up to give you the expectation. And if the payoff is unknown, that is, if the payoff, as you suggest, could change at the last minute, that introduces an uncertainty which might mean that your expectation is not what you thought it was. And a positive expectation, if the odds drop at the last minute, becomes a negative expectation. This is a problem. The idea is to try to bet at the very last minute, if possible, so you know the actual payoff odds as closely as possible. And mostly people have to build in a certain cushion on the assumption that the payoff odds can and usually do drop at the last minute on horses that are likely to win. So it's something you just have to deal with, and yes, it does hurt your profits, and the best time to bet always is the very last minute.
Are there any more questions? Okay, thank you very much, Bill. So